The first thing I smelled that morning was diesel. The second was trouble. At 5:47 a.m., the low growl of heavy equipment rolled across my ranch and rattled the window above my bed. For a second, I thought I was dreaming. Then came the sharp metallic clang of steel stakes hitting hard Texas soil. My eyes opened instantly. I threw on a pair of jeans, grabbed my boots, and stepped onto the porch. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet grass and mesquite from the eastern pasture. Normally, sunrise on my ranch was quiet. A few cattle moving through the grazing fields. The distant chirp of birds waking up. Maybe the hum of a windmill if the breeze was right. Not today. Today, there were trucks. Lots of them. White utility trucks. Survey vehicles. A bulldozer sitting near my south fence line. Orange safety vests moving through land my family had owned for 73 years. My stomach tightened. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I headed toward the commotion. The closer I got, the stronger the smell of diesel exhaust became. Men were unloading equipment. Others were hammering red survey stakes into the ground. One of those stakes stood less than 10 feet from a watering pond my grandfather built with his own hands in 1968. I stopped beside a pickup truck marked with the logo of a pipeline company I'd never heard of before. A man wearing a hard hat looked up from a clipboard. He smiled like everything was perfectly normal. "Morning, sir." I stared at him. "What exactly are you doing on my ranch?" He glanced at his paperwork. Calm. Confident. The kind of confidence people get when they think somebody else already handled the difficult part. "We're beginning preliminary work for the easement project." Easement project. The words hit me like a cold splash of water. "What easement project?" The man frowned slightly, then flipped through several pages. "The $9 million pipeline easement approved through Willow Creek Estates, HOA. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was impossible. My ranch wasn't part of Willow Creek Estates. Never had been. Never would be. The HOA sat nearly a mile away on the opposite side of the county road. "You're telling me an HOA granted a pipeline easement across my property?" His smile faded. He looked uncomfortable for the first time. "Sir, all approvals have been completed." Around us, engines continued rumbling. Workers kept unloading equipment. A survey crew walked toward my cattle pasture carrying tripods and GPS units. Nobody seemed concerned that the owner of the land had no idea why they were there. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. Every truck, every license plate, every stake, every face. Years of ranch ownership had taught me one thing. When something doesn't make sense, document everything. The foreman noticed. "If you have questions, you'll need to contact the HOA board." The HOA board. I looked across my land. Across the fences my father repaired every spring. Across the grazing fields my grandfather fought droughts to protect. Across the ranch where 3 generations of walkers had built a life. Somebody had signed a deal worth $9 million involving my property without ever speaking to me. And standing there in the rising Texas sunlight, with diesel fumes hanging in the air and survey flags spreading across my pasture like a disease, I had no idea that within 3 hours those same workers would be packing up their equipment while sheriff's deputies escorted them off my ranch. The foreman was still talking when I turned and walked back toward my truck. I barely heard the rest of what he said. My attention was locked on one question. How could anyone approve access to land they did not own? The morning sun was climbing higher now, throwing long shadows across the pasture. Every few seconds another orange survey flag appeared in the grass. Each one felt like a claim marker planted by strangers who believed the ranch already belonged to them. I climbed into my truck and pulled away from the work site. Gravel snapped beneath the tires as I headed toward the main house. The smell of diesel lingered in the air long after the machinery disappeared from view. By the time I stepped into my office, my coffee had gone cold. The room smelled faintly of old leather, cedar shelves, and the stack of property records my father always kept organized with military precision. My family never trusted handshakes when paperwork existed. That habit had saved us more than once. I opened the county property website and typed in my parcel number. The ownership records were exactly what they had always been. Walker Ranch Holdings. No easements. No transfers. No amendments. Nothing. Then I searched the subdivision. Willow Creek Estates. Hundreds of homes packed onto what used to be open grazing land decades ago. The HOA records were public. Board meeting minutes. Financial reports. Community improvement proposals. Most of it was the usual neighborhood business. landscaping contracts, pool maintenance, gate repairs. Then I found something that made my stomach tighten. 6 weeks earlier, the board had approved what they called a Regional Infrastructure Partnership Initiative. The language was vague, almost intentionally vague, but one line stood out. Proposed utility corridor extending through adjacent undeveloped acreage. Adjacent undeveloped acreage. That was how they described my ranch. 1,700 acres of family land reduced to 4 words on a document. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. The anger was there, but underneath it was something else. Curiosity. Because people do not take risks this large unless they think they are protected. Somebody had convinced an entire pipeline company that they had legal authority. Somebody had supplied documents. Somebody had signed their name. My phone rang. It was my ranch manager, Luke Henderson. His voice sounded uneasy. "Ethan, you need to see this." 10 minutes later, I met him at the south pasture. Luke was standing beside one of the red survey stakes. The wind pushed against the tall grass around us while cattle watched from a distance. He pointed toward the top of the marker. Attached to it was a laminated tag, a project identification label, the pipeline company name, the project number, a routing code, and beneath it, a printed authorization reference. Not from the county, not from the state, from Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I looked across the pasture again. The scale of it suddenly became real. They were not planning a future project. They believed construction was already authorized. The survey crews were only the beginning. Excavators would follow, trenching crews after that. Then miles of steel pipe cutting directly across land that had belonged to my family longer than most of the houses in that subdivision had existed. Luke shook his head slowly. "You think this is a mistake?" I looked down at the tag in my hand. The plastic crackled in the breeze. The authorization number was neatly printed. Professional, official, deliberate. No, this was not a mistake. Mistakes happen in private. This had gone through meetings, signatures, emails, contracts, and lawyers. Entire groups of people had participated. Somebody had built a $9 million project around the assumption that nobody would challenge it. And standing there beside that red survey stake, I realized something that made me far more nervous than the construction crews. Whoever approved this was absolutely certain they would win. The name behind the authorization appeared less than an hour later. I found it buried inside the HOA board records after 3 cups of stale coffee and far too much scrolling. Victoria Hayes, president of Willow Creek Estates. I already knew who she was. Everybody within 20 miles knew who she was. Victoria had a talent for appearing in local newspapers whenever a ribbon needed cutting or a camera needed a smile. Real estate developers loved her. County officials tolerated her. Homeowners either admired her or feared becoming her next target. There was rarely a middle ground. By noon, I was sitting in my truck outside the subdivision entrance. The stone monument sign stood nearly 20 feet tall, surrounded by imported landscaping and decorative fountains. Everything about the place felt expensive, polished, planned, the exact opposite of a working ranch. I watched golf carts move through immaculate streets while sprinklers hissed across perfectly trimmed lawns. The smell of fresh mulch hung in the warm air. It looked less like a neighborhood and more like a brochure. Victoria lived near the center of it all, a large house overlooking an artificial lake that had once been part of a cattle drainage basin before development arrived. I parked across the street and studied the property for a few minutes. Then I walked to the front door and rang the bell. The door opened almost immediately. Victoria Hayes looked exactly like every photograph I had ever seen. Perfect hair, perfect smile, crisp white blouse. The kind of person who treated every interaction like a campaign event. "Mr. Walker," she said before I introduced myself. I wondered how long it would take. That caught my attention. She had been expecting me. "You know who I am?" Her smile widened slightly. "Of course I do. We are neighbors." The word neighbors sounded strange coming from someone whose construction crews were standing on my land. I kept my voice calm. "Your people are surveying my ranch. Infrastructure improvements benefit everyone." There it was. No confusion, no apology, no surprise. She was not pretending a mistake had happened. She believed she was entitled to move forward. "You do not own my property," I said. "Neither does your HOA." Victoria folded her arms. The legal review determined otherwise. The legal review. Not a deed. Not ownership. Not consent. A legal review. Every instinct I had developed over 42 years told me that phrase mattered. People with strong evidence usually show it. People with weak evidence hide behind language. The breeze carried the scent of chlorine from the nearby community pool. Somewhere behind us, children laughed near the lake. Victoria remained completely relaxed. That bothered me more than if she had been angry. Confident people can be dangerous. Confident people with other people's money behind them are even worse. A pipeline company does not invest millions without paperwork, she said. They perform their due diligence. Then they should have talked to the landowner. Her smile disappeared for the first time. Only for a second. But I saw it. A crack in the armor. The project is moving forward, Mr. Walker. I looked directly at her. Then somebody is about to have a very expensive problem. She laughed softly. Not nervous laughter. Dismissive laughter. The kind people use when they think the outcome has already been decided. As I walked back toward my truck, I noticed something sitting on the passenger seat of a contractor vehicle parked nearby. A rolled engineering map. Across the top was a bold project title, and beneath it a route line stretching directly through my southern pasture. They were not discussing possibilities anymore. They had already planned the entire corridor. Distances, access roads, equipment staging areas, everything. Which meant Victoria was not simply supporting the project. She had been helping build it from the beginning. And for the first time, I started to wonder whether this was ever about infrastructure at all. That question stayed with me all the way home. The afternoon heat shimmered above the county road while dust trailed behind my truck. By the time I reached the ranch, the survey crews had already expanded their operation. More red flags dotted the pasture. More equipment had arrived. The metallic rattle of generators echoed across land that had been quiet for decades. I parked near the equipment staging area and watched from a distance. Workers moved with the confidence of people following a schedule that had been approved months ago. Nobody acted like there was a dispute. Nobody acted like ownership was still a question. They behaved as if the outcome had already been purchased. That evening I started digging deeper. The smell of coffee filled my office while stacks of records slowly covered my desk. County filings, planning commission agendas, utility applications, public notices. Most people never read those documents. That is exactly why important things get hidden inside them. Around 9 o'clock, I found the first piece that made everything click. A planning commission packet from 4 months earlier. Buried between drainage reports and traffic studies was a presentation regarding future expansion corridors. One slide showed projected home values. Another showed anticipated utility upgrades. Then I reached a page listing financial beneficiaries. Willow Creek Estates Development Enhancement Fund. The projected revenue number beside it made me stare twice. 7 figures. Not hundreds of thousands. Millions. Suddenly Victoria's enthusiasm made sense. This was never just about a utility line. This project was tied directly to future development plans surrounding the subdivision. Additional phases. Additional homes. Additional property values. Every acre of surrounding land became more valuable if the infrastructure arrived first. My ranch happened to sit in the most convenient path. I kept reading. The clock passed midnight. Crickets chirped outside the open window. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called across the darkness. Then I found another document. This one was not publicized nearly as heavily. A consulting agreement between the development group and a private planning firm. Attached to it was a routing analysis comparing 3 possible corridors. The first route crossed state land. Expensive permitting. The second crossed commercial property. Higher acquisition costs. The third crossed my ranch. Lowest projected cost by almost $9 million. $9 million. The number sat on the page like a flashing warning light. They were not investing $9 million. They were saving $9 million by using my property. That was the real value of the route. My ranch was not the destination. It was the shortcut. I leaned back and rubbed my eyes. The room smelled like paper and cold coffee. Every document revealed the same pattern. Meetings had happened. Consultants had been hired. Engineers had been contracted. Financial projections had been approved. Yet nowhere could I find a single agreement bearing my signature. Not one. The next morning brought another surprise. Luke called before sunrise. His voice sounded tense. You need to get down here. I was in my truck within minutes. The eastern horizon was turning orange when I reached the south pasture. Fresh tire tracks cut across the grass. New markers had appeared overnight. But that was not what caught my attention. Someone had installed a large project sign near the fence line. The sign displayed the pipeline company logo estimated completion dates, contractor information, and a bold statement announcing regional infrastructure expansion. Underneath was a sentence that made my jaw tighten. Authorized access granted through approved easement agreement. I stood there staring at it while the morning breeze rattled the edges of the sign. Whoever put that sign there wanted the world to believe the legal questions were already settled. They wanted certainty. They wanted momentum. They wanted people to stop asking questions. And the more evidence I uncovered, the more certain I became that somebody was counting on the landowner never looking closely enough to discover what was really hidden beneath the paperwork. The following 48 hours were some of the most frustrating of my life. Every door I knocked on seemed to open just long enough for someone to tell me there was nothing they could do. I started with the county planning office. The building smelled like old carpet, copier toner, and stale air conditioning. I sat across from a planning administrator named Greg who spent most of the meeting studying his monitor instead of looking at me. He clicked through files for nearly 10 minutes before finally leaning back in his chair. Everything submitted appears compliant from our side. I slid copies of property maps across the desk. They are routing a major utility project through private land. He nodded slowly. That may be true, but the authorization package we received included supporting documentation. Supporting documentation. Another vague phrase. Another person hiding behind paperwork he had never personally verified. When I asked to see the documents, he explained that portions were protected by confidentiality agreements connected to ongoing development plans. I left feeling like I had just argued with a brick wall. Next came the pipeline company. Their regional office sat inside a glass building 40 miles away. Everything smelled new. Fresh paint, polished floors, expensive coffee. A project manager named Alan Cooper greeted me in a conference room overlooking the parking lot. He wore the expression of a man who believed facts were on his side. I explained the situation. I explained ownership. I explained the lack of consent. Alan listened politely before folding his hands on the table. Mr. Walker, we have invested considerable resources into route planning. That is not my problem. His smile tightened slightly. Our legal department reviewed the access package months ago. There it was again. Legal department. Legal review. Supporting documentation. Everyone seemed to trust a stack of papers more than the actual owner standing in front of them. By the time I drove back to the ranch, the sun was setting behind the western hills. Orange lights stretched across the pasture while cattle moved slowly through the grass. Normally that view calmed me. Not that evening. I could still hear Alan's words replaying in my head. Considerable resources. As if money somehow transformed assumptions into rights. The next morning brought another blow. I met with a property attorney recommended by a business associate. His office overlooked the courthouse square. Leather chairs, law books, diplomas covering the walls. He spent nearly an hour reviewing the documents I had collected. The scratching of his pen seemed louder than the ticking clock behind him. Finally, he removed his glasses and sighed. Ethan, I am going to be honest with you. Those words are rarely followed by good news. Large infrastructure projects are difficult to stop once they reach this stage. Difficult is not impossible. He hesitated. You could spend years fighting this. Years. The word landed like a weight in my chest. Outside the window, people walked through the square carrying coffee cups and shopping bags, completely unaware that my family's land might be tied up in legal battles longer than some college degrees. For the first time since this started, doubt crept in. Maybe Victoria knew something I did not. Maybe there really was a document hidden somewhere. Maybe the reason everyone seemed so confident was because the fight had already been decided before I even learned it existed. That night, I sat alone on the porch listening to the wind move through the oak trees. The smell of dust and dry grass filled the air. Across the ranch, the project sign stood near the fence line, visible even in the fading light. A declaration that somebody else's plans mattered more than my ownership. I stared at it for a long time. Then my phone vibrated. The message came from an attorney I had not spoken to in years. 3 simple sentences. Call me immediately. I think I found something. And just like that, the first spark of hope returned. The call came at 9:13 that night. I recognized the name immediately. Daniel Mercer. We had worked together years earlier during a boundary dispute involving neighboring ranch properties. Daniel was not the kind of attorney who called without a reason. When I answered, I could hear papers rustling on his end of the line. Tell me you still have the original family records. I sat up straight in my chair. Most of them. What? A brief silence followed. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Because somebody forgot to read a document from 1972. 20 minutes later, I was driving toward his office. The courthouse square was nearly empty. Streetlights reflected off dark storefront windows while the smell of rain drifted through the warm night air. Daniel was waiting inside with several large folders spread across a conference table. He looked exhausted, excited. The combination usually meant he had found something important. Without saying a word, he slid a yellowed map toward me. The paper felt brittle beneath my fingers. Survey lines stretched across the property in faded ink. I immediately recognized the southern pasture where the proposed route had been marked. Daniel tapped a section near the center of the map. This is what everybody missed. At first I did not see it. Then he handed me a magnifying sheet. Tiny handwritten language appeared along the boundary notes. Not typed. Handwritten. Added during a land restructuring agreement more than 50 years earlier. The notation referenced a conservation restriction tied to watershed protection and livestock water access. I frowned. What does that mean? Daniel smiled for the first time all evening. It means nobody can grant utility access through that corridor without approval from multiple state agencies. I stared at him. The HOA cannot do it. Correct. The developers cannot do it. Correct. The pipeline company cannot do it. Correct. The room suddenly felt very quiet. For nearly a week, every official I spoke with had acted as though the project was unstoppable. Yet a handwritten clause sitting inside an old survey archive changed everything. Daniel opened another folder. Inside were copies of supplemental filings attached to the original restriction. There were more than I expected. Amendments, environmental reviews, water management protections. Every document reinforced the same principle. The protected corridor existed specifically because previous owners had agreed to preserve water movement through the ranch. Any major excavation required an entirely different approval process, one that had never happened. The smell of old paper filled the room while I turned page after page. My pulse quickened with every document. Not because we had won, not yet, but because for the first time the facts were finally pointing in one direction. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Now comes the interesting part, which is, he slid a final packet across the table. Recent project filings, engineering diagrams, authorization forms. There, buried in the supporting documentation, sat the route line crossing directly through the protected area. The same route displayed on the project sign. The same route marked by the survey stakes. The same route Victoria had defended so confidently. Daniel tapped the page with his finger. They either never found the restriction. He paused. Or they found it and moved forward anyway. The air conditioner hummed softly above us. Outside, a delivery truck rolled through the square. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Because if the first possibility was true, the project had been built on incompetence. But if the second possibility was true, somebody had ignored a restriction that should have stopped the entire plan before it ever reached my ranch. Daniel gathered the folders into a neat stack. Do not call anyone tomorrow. That surprised me. Why not? His expression turned unreadable. Because I want them to keep believing everything is proceeding exactly according to schedule. Then he closed the file containing the old map from 1972, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I had the feeling that somebody else was about to walk straight into a trap of their own making. For the next 3 days, Daniel seemed to disappear. Calls went unanswered. Emails received no response. Even his office assistant claimed he was out of meetings more often than in them. Under normal circumstances, that would have worried me. Instead, it confirmed exactly what he had told me. Let them keep moving. Let them believe everything was on schedule. And that is exactly what happened. Every morning brought more activity on the southern edge of the ranch. New vehicles arrived. More equipment appeared. Survey teams walked the same route carrying clipboards and GPS units. The smell of diesel became a daily visitor. The project sign remained beside the fence line, standing there like a monument to somebody else's confidence. Meanwhile, Victoria seemed happier than ever. Local newspapers published articles celebrating future infrastructure improvements. Community newsletters praised the economic benefits. Developers gave interviews about growth opportunities. It was like watching people celebrate a finish line they had not actually crossed. The strangest part was how quickly everyone stopped asking questions. Once enough official-looking paperwork exists, Most people assume the details have already been verified. They trust logos. They trust signatures. They trust presentations shown on projector screens. Few people stop to ask whether the foundation underneath those documents is actually solid. Late Thursday afternoon, I drove past Willow Creek Estates on my way back from town. Decorative fountains sprayed into the air near the entrance. Landscaping crews trimmed hedges along the boulevard. Everything looked polished, prosperous, certain. As I passed the community clubhouse, I noticed several luxury vehicles parked outside. A board meeting. Through the windows, I could see people gathered around tables. Victoria stood near the front of the room, speaking to the audience. Even from a distance, I could recognize that familiar expression, the smile of someone presenting a victory. I kept driving. There was no point interrupting. Not yet. Back at the ranch, Luke met me near the equipment staging area. The evening sun painted the grass golden, while cattle drifted toward the watering pond. He handed me a folded notice that workers had left attached to a temporary marker. The document outlined the next phase of activity: preliminary ground access, equipment mobilization, route preparation. The dates listed were only days away. "They are accelerating," Luke said quietly. I nodded. They were, which meant pressure was building. Companies do not move expensive machinery according to hope. They move according to schedules. Every delay costs money. Every adjustment creates headaches. Somewhere above the field, a hawk circled slowly in the warm air. I unfolded the notice again and studied the timeline. They were preparing for a major push. Exactly the moment Daniel seemed to be waiting for. Friday evening finally brought the first call. Not from Daniel himself. From a county records specialist I had never spoken with before. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. She asked several questions about historical property surveys. She confirmed parcel numbers. Then she thanked me and ended the call. An hour later, another call arrived, this time from an environmental compliance office. More questions, more confirmations. By midnight, I had received 4 separate calls from agencies that previously acted as if the project barely existed. Somebody was pulling threads behind the scenes. Somebody was forcing people to look at documents they had ignored for months. Yet outwardly nothing changed. The crews continued preparing. The developers continued smiling. Victoria continued acting like the outcome was guaranteed. Early Saturday morning, I stepped onto the porch carrying a cup of coffee. The air smelled of rain and fresh earth. Clouds rolled across the horizon, while distant engines echoed from the south pasture. Activity had already started for the day. I watched the movement for several minutes before my phone buzzed. A single message appeared from Daniel. No explanation. No greeting. Just 7 words. "Everything is ready. Let them arrive on Monday." Monday arrived with the smell of diesel and wet grass hanging in the air before sunrise. I was already standing on the porch when the first headlights appeared along the county road. 1 truck became 3. 3 became 10. By 6:30 in the morning, a convoy of equipment was moving toward the southern pasture exactly as scheduled. The rumble of engines rolled across the ranch while workers unloaded barriers, survey gear, and construction supplies. Everything looked organized, efficient, expensive. The project managers moved through the site carrying clipboards and radios. Nobody seemed worried. Why would they be? As far as they knew, every approval had been secured. Every signature had been collected. Every obstacle had already been removed. I drove down to the pasture and parked beside Luke's truck. Together we watched the activity unfold. Fresh coffee steamed from the cup in my hand, while orange sunlight slowly spread across the grass. The project sign stood near the fence line exactly where it had been all week. The same sign that claimed authorized access had already been granted. Around 7:15, another vehicle arrived. A black luxury sport utility vehicle. Victoria stepped out wearing sunglasses and a bright smile. She looked like someone attending a grand opening ceremony. Several people greeted her immediately. Handshakes, small talk, confident laughter. She never looked in my direction. That was fine. I was more interested in the county road. At 7:28, the first sheriff vehicle appeared over the hill. Then another. Then another. The flashing lights were not activated. The vehicles simply rolled forward at a steady pace before stopping near the entrance to the work area. Conversations slowed. Several workers paused what they were doing. A few project managers exchanged confused looks. Victoria removed her sunglasses. Daniel arrived moments later carrying a thick leather folder under his arm. He walked directly past the equipment and toward the project supervisors. Calm, unhurried, like a man arriving exactly where he expected to be. The morning breeze carried the scent of fresh earth, while dozens of people gradually stopped working to watch. One of the supervisors stepped forward and began speaking with Daniel. At first, the conversation seemed routine. Then Daniel opened the folder. He removed several documents and handed them over. I could not hear every word from where I stood, but I did not need to. The supervisor's expression changed almost immediately. Confusion became concern. Concern became disbelief. More documents followed. Additional pages. Survey records. Agency notices. Copies of the restriction filings. Behind them, sheriff personnel began speaking with other project representatives. Phones appeared. Calls were made. The atmosphere shifted completely. The confidence that had filled the site all morning started draining away. Victoria moved toward the group, clearly demanding answers. Nobody seemed eager to provide them. Within 30 minutes, every major conversation on the site revolved around the same issue. The protected corridor. The missing approvals. The restrictions nobody had properly addressed. The route line that should never have been authorized. The final moment came shortly before 8 o'clock. A formal stop notice was delivered and acknowledged. Equipment remained parked. Work halted. Activity ceased. The engines that had filled the pasture with noise all morning gradually fell silent. One by one, workers began packing equipment back into their trucks. Survey crews removed gear. Managers gathered documents. Radios crackled with instructions that sounded very different from the ones they had expected to hear that morning. I looked across the pasture toward the red survey stakes that had started this entire mess. The same markers that once represented certainty now stood untouched in the grass. And as truck after truck turned around and headed back toward the county road, I realized the people who spent months believing they had already won were finally being forced to confront a possibility they had never seriously considered. The land they thought belonged to their project had never been available in the first place. The silence after the trucks left felt different. For more than a week, the ranch had been filled with noise. Engines, generators, survey equipment, radios. Now all I could hear was wind moving through the grass and cattle grazing near the pond. The smell of diesel slowly faded over the next few days, replaced by the familiar scent of cedar, dry earth, and fresh water. It felt like the ranch was finally breathing again. What happened after that Monday turned out to be even more expensive than anyone expected. Once the restriction documents reached the appropriate agencies, reviews began almost immediately. The same offices that had ignored questions before suddenly became very interested in the approval process. Records were requested. Correspondence was examined. Project filings were reviewed line by line. The deeper people looked, the more uncomfortable the situation became. It turned out the protected corridor had been referenced multiple times throughout historical records. Not once, not twice, multiple times. The information had always been there. The problem was that everyone involved had trusted summaries instead of original documents. They trusted presentations instead of property records. They trusted assumptions instead of verification. And when millions of dollars depend on assumptions, mistakes become very expensive. The pipeline company announced a suspension of the route evaluation process. Consultants were brought in. Attorneys appeared. Meetings multiplied. Nobody seemed eager to discuss future construction anymore. The route crossing my ranch disappeared from every public project map within 2 weeks. Then came the development side of the story. Several investors began asking questions about projected timelines. Homeowners started attending board meetings demanding explanations. Local reporters discovered the halted project and quickly realized there was a story behind it. Victoria Hayes suddenly found herself answering questions instead of asking them. For years, she had controlled the narrative. Now she could not control the facts. The newspapers never accused anyone of wrongdoing. They did not need to. The timeline spoke for itself. The records spoke for themselves. Every article seemed to raise another question. Why had ownership concerns been ignored? Why had historical restrictions been overlooked? Why had the project moved forward before critical approvals were confirmed? The confidence that once surrounded the plan slowly evaporated. One evening about a month later, I drove past Willow Creek Estates on my way home. The fountains still operated. The landscaping still looked perfect. The subdivision looked exactly the same from the outside. But the atmosphere felt different. The certainty was gone. The clubhouse parking lot sat nearly empty. Several board positions had already changed hands. Victoria's name no longer appeared on the community website. I never spoke with her again. There was no reason to. Everything that needed to be said had already been written in the documents she failed to read. A few days after that, Daniel and I stood near the old survey stake closest to the pond. It was still there, faded now after weeks under the Texas sun. The same little marker that had once represented a $9 million shortcut. Daniel pulled it from the ground and handed it to me. "Souvenir?" he asked. I laughed and tossed it into the bed of my truck. The metallic clink echoed briefly before disappearing into the afternoon air. Looking across the pasture, I could see the same view my grandfather had seen decades earlier. The pond, the cattle, the rolling grass stretching toward the horizon. Nothing had changed because the people who came after him had done one simple thing. They kept the records. They protected the land. They paid attention when others stopped paying attention. That ranch was never saved by luck. It was saved by patience, by documentation, by one forgotten note written on a survey more than 50 years earlier. People often think power belongs to whoever has the biggest budget, the largest company, or the loudest voice in the room. What I learned is that real power usually sits quietly inside a file cabinet until somebody finally opens the right folder. They thought signatures and presentations could take my land. Turns out the only document that mattered was the one they never bothered to read. Justice is not loud. It is patient. And eventually, it arrives right on schedule.